Flanders Friend, Chapter 10, entitled Game. Tim walked quickly through the streets. He couldn't wait to reach the edge of the woods and see Arthur. Arthur was sitting on a broken down tree trunk and looking content, which was surprising in this wet weather, thought Timothy. And Arthur grinned broadly when he saw Tim pull out his battered cricket bat. That's a beauty, Arthur said, holding the handle and practicing his swing. Tim laughed loudly. It was the first time that he had laughed in ages. Look at the rain had begun to just be a trickle, which helped. Ball up then, said Arthur, and Tim ran back 20 yards, and he nervously ran with the ball, and he arched his arm, and he watched the yellow tennis ball fly towards Arthur, who stood determined with the bat in his hand with a steely look on his face, as if he was facing an opponent at the oval. Thwacky connected with the ball and it sailed over Tim's head and it landed on the frosty ground looking like a newly laid egg. Great strike, said Tim, grinning broadly. I'm proud of that shot, said Arthur. Do you want to go? He said, looking at a worried looking Tim. Okay, said Tim, but he wasn't so sure. Just a quick go, he added. He didn't want to be late for school again. Arthur ran towards him in his khaki uniform, and Tim gripped the bat in his sweaty hands, and the last thing that he wanted to do was to miss. The ball came towards him in a blur, and he felt it clip against the side of the bat. Tim was lucky, but he didn't care. The ball went off at an odd angle, and he could see Arthur running to catch it. It was hilarious. It was difficult for Tim not to laugh out loud. Arthur surprised Tim and himself by diving for the ball. How's that? He shouted in triumph, and he held up the ball in his hand, delighted. Great catch, said Tim, as he ran over to congratulate him. I have to go to school now, he said a little sadly. It's a shame I can't play cricket on my own, said Arthur with a disappointed shrug. Don't worry, said Tim, I'll be back, as he hurried over the frosty fields. Tim sat through the lessons and he felt happier than he had in a long time. He'd even forgotten to tell Arthur about the bullying. Maybe he thought that was a good thing. The last thing that he wanted to do was to add to Arthur's troubles. It was while in the canteen that he was waiting to tuck into his lovely fish pie that things changed forever. Unusually, the headmaster put his hand on his shoulder, and before he knew it, Tim was in the head's office and he was surrounded by a group of nervous looking teachers with worried looks on their faces. Maybe they know about Arthur, thought Tim, trying to grasp the strange situation. But the news was worse, more than that, far worse. The only words he could make out were crash, accident, and death. Everything was becoming unreal and blurred. How could his dad be dead, he thought, as the room seemed to spin round and round. The rest of the day went by in a blur, and when he got home, he saw his mum slumped in an armchair, and it looked like she had aged 10 years. Tim thought sadly. Then suddenly she lifted herself out of the chair and she hugged Tim, and they spent the rest of the evening remembering Dad through their tears. That night Tim willed himself to sleep, but memories of Dad kept returning to haunt him, and the pain was unbearable. His chest heaved with the pain, and his pillow was wet with tears. He woke the next morning and he went downstairs for breakfast. It was unusually quiet, and everything that he did and saw just reminded him of his dad. Oh, God. He ate his breakfast in silence. His mum was still sleeping, and he decided to let her be. She had suffered enough, he thought. Tim looked at his dad's empty chair, around the breakfast table, and tears filled his eyes and threatened to roll down his once innocent cheeks. Tim didn't want to go to school. He wanted to run away, but he had nowhere to run to. At least I have Arthur, he thought, and he struggled into his duffel coat, and he felt a bit like a teddy bear, but at least he was warm. Once again he was hit by a cold blast of air, and it dried his tearful eyes and woke him up to the day which stretched in front of him like a huge, horrible mountain. Each step he took went against his will. Every nerve and sinew in his body told him to jump back into bed. But he knew that it wouldn't help. He had to keep going. He had to be strong. As soon as Arthur saw him, he knew that something was very wrong. Tim tried to smile, but the pain in his eyes betrayed him. Are you okay? Said Arthur, with a concerned look on his face. Have you run into bullies again? He inquired, but it was a lot worse than that. Tim sat on a log next to Arthur, and he told him the terrible news. Let the tears fall, and Arthur put his hand on his shoulder. It was hard to know what to say. Coming up the next chapter.